If you're looking to make something like this, it's gritty, it's dirty, it's grungy, then you're in the right place. As always, we are going to open a new composition. Let's make this 4K, 7 seconds or something, whatever you need. Text, anything you want. I'm gonna write Danger Zone. Definitely not in this font though. I think I'm gonna use Presio, which is a part of the Adobe font kit. If you're in After Effects, you've got this font for free. So I'm just going to center that up. I tend to use an expression for anchor points to center them. Just for this, I'm just going to center it by, you hit Y to get the pan behind tool, which is just something where you can click and drag the anchor point, and then I hold down Command to center it. Let's already start doing some stylization. So I'm going to want to wiggle the position of it so it's constantly kind of jittering. So I hit P for position and Alt click on the stopwatch, and now I'm going to type wiggle, open brackets, let's go with 10,10. A little bit too smooth if we want that kind of 1960s messed up film look. Actually, let's put in a new adjustment layer, and we're going to call this posterize, and we're going to go into the effects and we're going to find posterize time. This is in 24 frames at the moment. I'm going to halve it to 12. Now let's see what that looks like. I actually want it to be even less smooth, so let's go down to say like 7. But see, that's looking more like what I want it to look like. Very jerky. If you can't be bothered to do this entire tutorial, there is another way. We've created 40 plus retro titles, and this one is included. It's the ultimate retro title toolkit, and it's called Nostalgia. You can use them in After Effects or Premiere Pro. They're super easy to customize. It's like a one-click time machine. To get Nostalgia today, the link is in the description. So now we're just going to start to degrade the heck out of this. I'm going to start with a radial blur. I just feel like I want to blur those edges a bit, so I'm going to go with the amount to be 1. You can start to see this kind of weird kind of blur degrading. I don't know, it's just a cool little detail. It's sharper in the middle than it is in the edges. We could even make this text a little bit bigger, and let's center it up using the align tool. And yes, we haven't used any color yet. We're going to get to that, but let's do all these effects first, and we're going to color it near the end. So we've got posterize time, radial blur. What else can we do? Well, I feel like we want to blur just like different sections of it at different times. So we're going to create a new solid, make it to comp size, and we're going to put fractal noise on this. Now, we're going to use fractal noise about 20 times in this, so best get used to using fractal noise. Let's change this contrast to maybe like 300, just really contrasty, a little bit too much of those white areas, so I'm just going to go down to maybe -30, a little bit less complex, let's maybe make it 3. Let's scale this up to maybe, I don't know, like 1,000 or so. We could keyframe the evolution, or we could use an expression. So I'm going to alt click on the stopwatch, and I'm going to type in time times 400. That might be too fast. Let's have a look. That's probably too much. Let's maybe try 250. I don't know. You can tell that I'm making it up as I go along. So I reckon about 250 is correct. Maybe let's call it blur fractal. I'm going to turn it off, and then I'm going to create another adjustment layer. I don't know about you guys, but I don't tend to make a new adjustment layer for everything I do. I know they always say make a new adjustment layer in every tutorial, but what I usually do is I take the adjustment layer I already have and drag it onto the timeline. And then this little button here makes any solid an adjustment layer. I don't know if you knew that. And I just have this weird, I don't want to call it an OCD, but I need to have less solids. Like, I don't like having even that and that. I'll go through and I will find where this is by going reveal and composition, and then I will replace it by holding Alt and dragging and dropping that onto there. No one else does that, right? Just me. And then I'll have 3 or 4 solids. I don't know why I do this. I just do it. Okay? So in this, we're going to use a compound blur, and this is what's going to be the map for this blur fractal that we just created that we haven't used yet. So it's going to map all of these white areas are going to be blurry, and all the black areas are going to do nothing. And so we're going to switch off that blur fractal again, and we're going to go in here, and for the blur layer, we're going to pick blur fractal. If we pick effects and masks on there. That's important because otherwise it's not going to pick up the fractal noise in there. Now you can see, if I zoom in, I mean you can see it anyway, but all of these white bits here, so if I switch this on, that there, all the white is the bit that's blurred, and all the black over here is doing nothing. It's meant to emulate film imperfections when it's being projected. By the way, I'm just going to name this comp edit or text edit, something like that, because we are going to pre-comp it in a minute. Let's rename this to compound blur or blur. See, that's looking pretty good, but I still want this text to be even more degraded. We're really messing with it. So it's just a bit, well, it's digital, isn't it? It's sharp and it's digital. Underneath this blur, it's very sharp. Let's actually start messing with the text itself down here. We could put it on one of the adjustment layers, but I'm just going to do it on here. So I'm going to use the simple choker. Let's just solo this layer so we can see what's going on. I'm going to change this from final output to matte. If you take the choke matte down, you get an expanded look on it. And if you drag it up, you take the edges off, and now it looks like kind of a 90s grunge kind of look. I'm gonna go about 20 for this, and it's just gonna take these edges off. This font has a lot of angular edges. I'm rounding them all off. You know, there's just like a really extreme bloom. The other thing I want to do here is use roughen edges. I just don't want the text to be quite so perfect. If you've got really degraded film stock, it's just going to kind of warp everything. So there's a few ways of warping things. Often I use wave warp to do this, but I'm going to try roughen edges this time. I'll just push this scale to like 400. Take off some of the sharpness on the edges of the text as well. So maybe 0.5 or 0.4. You can see this kind of warping on the edges now, where it's just not quite perfect. So this is what we got so far. Looking good, but not looking degraded enough. So drag this text edit into another comp. I've used this on black, right? But you can use it pretty much on any color you want. There's just some minor changes that need to be made. If you wanted to use it on a different color, I would change it to final output rather than matte in my simple choker, because if we look here, now we've got this big black box, which we don't want. So you can go final output, and then you just kind of need to tweak your numbers accordingly. But you know, anyway. So if I go back into our new pre-comp, I'm going to call this one final or export or something like that, so I know. I'm going to put a new layer as a solid for my background, make comp size, and as I said before, I would have just dragged one of these in because this is too much for me. I'm gonna use a fill color here, but what we want here is, instead of pure black, which is way too digital, we're gonna wanna just offset that a little bit. Because I'm gonna make my text red, I might even have a little bit of contrast in the tone, so I might just make it a slightly cooler gray. You know, imperceptible to a certain degree, but it does change it. I don't know if you can already see that looking a little bit more filmic with just that little bit of gray and that little bit of color. So now we've got this text edit. We're going to fill that as well because we wanted this to be red, right? And again, it can be any color you want. Red, that red is just digital, right? So we can like back that off a bit, and I might even go a bit darker on it because I'm going to turn this second text into kind of like the text glow. So I'm going to change it, the mode to screen, and then on this second one, we're going to add a blur. Let's just use a fast blur because it renders a lot quicker. Let's go like, you know, 25 or so. See, now we've got this kind of glow around it. I'm just going to push the brightness of that up a whole bunch. Now we've got just that little bit of glow on the outer edges here, and you can mess with how big you want that glow to be, but in this sense we're just going to go with kind of a smaller glow. So let's start messing this up. It's still too digital, you know what I'm saying? So I'm going to do what I said I was going to do. I'm going to drag my adjustment layer in and make it an adjustment layer, and I'm going to call this one, I don't know, noise 1 or something. I'm going to have a few noise layers as well, so let's go up and choose noise, and we're going to go crazy with this one. You know, normally you're like, oh, 5 to 15% is what you want if you want to emulate grain. 100%. Boom. And then I'm going to add a blur on top of that. So I'm just looking for kind of more of a chunky look. I'm going to blur that a little bit, and then even though it's an adjustment layer, I'm actually going to use the overlay blending mode. See how it's completely changed the color again, and so we might want to go back in and start messing with the color or changing the opacity on this to make it less aggressive. if I go 100%, this grain is in overlay, so it's mostly only showing in between full brightness and full darkness. So pull this back a bit to say 30, so we've got, you know, it's still there, but it's not as aggressive, and we've got some of this color back. All right, so you can see a little bit of our progress. We're looking good, but I want this to flicker as well. And so most of the time we would just take like a flat black solid and wiggle the opacity to flicker the whole thing. What I'm gonna wanna do is create another fractal noise layer. So I'm gonna drag a solid that I've already made in, because it's just one of my quirks, and we're gonna call it fractal noise. Let's drag that on there. So I'm gonna change this to like 65, not a whole lot of contrast. I'm gonna bring the brightness down a bunch, maybe like -40. There we go, nice and dark. We're gonna change the complexity to maybe like 9 this time round, so it's going up. What this is really gonna end up being is grit, so I'm gonna change the name of that now. And then we'll wanna change the scale, I don't know, like 450, something like that. So again, we've got similar to what we had last time, just a little bit darker and a little bit more complex this time. As before, we're gonna use time times, what did we get to? Like 250 or so look good for our evolution, so that we go from 0 to like 4 something. So we've animated our evolution as well. So it kind of is constantly moving. It's pretty fast. So we want to be able to see what we're actually doing. Let's change the blending mode to screen. And now you've got all this, you know, kind of white cloud thing, which is cool, but I don't really want to be able to see it very much. I'm going to go all the way down to like 3 or 5 or something like that. It's kind of almost imperceptible. We're going to add wiggle like we did before, but this time we're going to go nuts with it. So 700 by 10. And so now you'll be able to see it that little bit more. So that's why I can have the opacity so low, is because that 700 means it's really going to jump out at you every once in a while. And because that's almost strobing, I'm going to want to put another posterized time. Now I know we posterized the text already, but yeah, I like it to be a little bit inconsistent in this case. So I'm going to make this adjustment layer an adjustment layer, and we're going to change it to, call it posterize. We're going to change it to posterized time, and again like 12, you know, half the frame rate. If you don't happen to have 35mm grains or 16mm grains stock, which I would highly recommend you buy, if you don't have that, then you can use noise to emulate grain, as we said before. And I know we just put noise a bit further down there, but this is what, you know, is now meant to emulate the actual film noise. So like 3 or 5, we're not going to use color noise in this case. And it will be hard for you to see on YouTube because of the compression, but you can kind of see it in here in the blacks. It's in the blacks now as well, and that's why we're doing it. So it's everywhere. I want a few more, you know, imperfections. There's these blurs that are kind of moving around, you know, the grit is flickering on and off, but let's create another layer of imperfection with another blur. I'm going to put it below my grain and my posterize. Should it go below the grit? No, we'll leave it on top. So again, it's an adjustment layer. I'm going to call this directional blur. And I'm going to use the effect directional blur. And you can do this like straight up and down. You know, like vertically, but I'm gonna go maybe like back it off a little bit so it's kind of like diagonally. I don't know why, it just, you know, looks like something that would happen. I just want it to kind of come on and off, so you can animate the actual blur length. So, you know, you have a keyframe that's 0 and then it goes up to, you know, 100 and then back down to 0. But the way that I want this to look is a little bit different. So I'm just gonna I'm gonna maybe take this up to like 300, so it's redonkulous, and then I'm actually gonna keyframe the opacity instead of the blur, which sounds like a bad idea, but it's gonna show through differently, which is kind of what I want. So I'm gonna go from, you know, 0 to 100 back to 0. I'm just chucking in some keyframes to see what it looks like. Now you can see it's almost less like a blur and more like a glow that just kind of happens. So even that 100% might be too much, and you might just want it to kind of end up at 70% or something like that. For the sake of time, I'm just gonna go through and add a bunch of like random keyframes so that just kind of happens from time to time. All right, so this is where we're at. I mean, we could stop there. It already looks pretty cool, you know? I just added a few of those flashes. The add blending mode is really helping. It's kind of randomized. I mean, you could even set this up to randomize more using expressions versus keyframes, but I just wanted to control it just a little bit. I'm probably only going to do 2 more things to this to really put it over the top. One of them is chuck on some 16mm texture. I use a stock one for nostalgia. I kind of created my own, which sounds crazy. Actually, let me just show you what it looks like. So for nostalgia, I made my own 16mm grain noise. This is just like a little 2-second snippet of it, using shapes, using fractal noise, using noise, just so that people who don't have it can, you know, take the title straight out of the box and it just works. Like, that's a line. You know, that's a little bit of fractal noise. So anyway, so in nostalgia, you could do that. I wouldn't recommend doing it this way. It's not going to look as good as if you just bought it. It's not going to cost you that much. You're going to use it all the time. So this time around, I'm not going to show you exactly how I built those because it would just take too long, and honestly, no one should ever do it again. But I'm just going to drag both versions of this on. In this case, I've used a screen blending mode. You know, there's an opacity wiggle on them, but that'll definitely add to it and aid to it, but I would highly recommend just buying a grain pack and just using that. Maybe I should make one in the future. So now we get to the good part. We're going to do these little motion tile moments where the film is kind of spinning out of step with the projector, which gives you that kind of rolling effect. So we're going to do this with 2 things. First, we're going to build a frame so that when it rolls, we can see the edge of it. And this is one of the good reasons why the background is not completely black, so that we can actually see that frame edge. And then we're going to do the roll. So the frame's pretty simple. We're just going to grab a black solid. We're going to put it maybe up here somewhere. I'm just going to move this grain up here. So now we've just got this black solid. We're going to call it frame, and it's covering everything as we can see. Let's turn that on so you can see it. And I'm just very basically going to kind of draw a, you know, frame so that the top and bottom is still visible, and I'm going to invert it. So now you've got these kind of black bars at the top and bottom. And we'll want to go and feather that a little bit, maybe like 30 or 40, something like that. So now it's a little bit more feathered. So now we've got the frame. Let's do a film roll. So we're going to drag an adjustment layer down, and I might put it on top of everything that's going on. Find the effect motion tile. And the way this works is that we can kind of move the tile center, and you'll see it start to kind of like roll. And then we've got, you know, our black line in the middle there. Select the tile center, put a keyframe where it currently is, because that's fine. And then you can either do 2 things. You can use math to create the endpoint, or you can just scroll until it lines up again. It doesn't actually have to be that precise. And then you just kind of decide how many of these scrolls do you want it to go. Do you want it to go past 3 times or 4 times? I don't need the rest of that, so I just hit Option square brackets, you know, to kind of cut that off. And then I'm going to easy ease both of these. So right click, easy ease in. You might want to go into the graph editor and just kind of move the handles a little bit so that it starts slower and then speeds up. And it should look something like this. Take that and kind of duplicate it, and then you can kind of change how, you know, you can change how many times it rotates. Maybe it's not always, you know, the 3 or 4. Maybe this one is a lot shorter and faster. And there's just these little moments. Put one at the very start and one at the very end, so that if you had it looping, then it's a more seamless way to transition from one thing to another if it rolls in and then rolls out. And then the very final thing that you might want to do, just because you've got this frame here, you can kind of treat it in 2 ways. One thing you can do is you can literally set keyframes. So say you just put a keyframe there for, just so I can see it for now. So I'll change that keyframe. That's 100, and there we're going to go down to 0, and we're going to change these to holding keyframes. So it's kind of more of a digital versus analog. So it's just on or off. So 0 and then down to 100. So that's 100, and then this one's 0. So that whole keyframe. So that now that border's completely off, but then when we get to the bit where it rolls, it suddenly appears. And even though that's a little bit clunky, you can't really perceive that it's happening. See, it just kind of appears as it starts to roll. So that's one way you can do it, and that's the way I'm doing it here. The other way you can do it is that you can use, make a adjustment layer and then use transform. So I don't know if you use transform, but it's actually quite useful for a lot of things, distort transform. So instead of using keyframes on a bunch of stuff, like say wiggle or other things, you can actually keyframe an adjustment layer to do all of that. So you can even, say scale this up using just an adjustment layer versus, whatever else. Yeah, it can be really useful. In this case, you might just want to say, okay, let's get rid of all of those keyframes, and it's always there, but I'm just going to scale this up until I can no longer see them. So then now at 106, when I roll, it's still there. So that's another way that you can do it. Just put a transform on everything.